The next thing I want to do is thank our partners. Charis Books and More is an amazing independent bookstore here in Decatur, Georgia. And it actually functions as Agnes Scott College's bookstore. So I don't know that there are that many colleges in the country that have this opportunity to have an independent bookstore as the college bookstore. And the other partner tonight is the All We Can Save project, which Katharine will talk about more. It's a nonprofit that's spun off of this book. So my last duty is to introduce Katharine Wilkinson. And Katharine, I'm going to use your book cover biography because there's lots to say about Katharine, but this is short and to the point. Dr. Katharine Wilkinson, who will be our moderator tonight, is an author, strategist, teacher, and homegrown Atlantan, named one of the 15 Women Who Will Save the World by Time magazine. Her writing has been featured in the Drawdown Review and in the New York Times bestseller, Drawdown. And she's also the author of Between God and Green. And as I turn it over to Katharine, I'd like to say what a colleague and friend she is to Agnes Scott College. We appreciate, Katharine, all you do for us, including bringing this amazing group of speakers here with you tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan, so much. This is really exciting to have this group together tonight to do this with Agnes Scott and Charis. I can't think of two better partners for kind of the spirit and the ethos of this book. This is the book that we're going to talk about tonight. All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And the book takes its inspiration for its title from Adrienne Rich, from a closing stanza of her poem, Natural Resources. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And my heart, I think I can speak for all of us when I say our hearts are also moved by all we cannot save, and also by all that we still can. And that is really what this book is about, to hold the hard truths of where we are and to keep our radical imaginations going, and working towards canines coming in hot. That's Arthur. Working towards what is still possible. He's extremely excited about what is still possible. The climate crisis is a leadership crisis. And if the task before us is to transform society this decade, it's going to take transformational leadership to get us there. And to my mind and to my co-editor, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, to her mind as well, that kind of transformational leadership is both more characteristically feminine and more committedly feminist, grounded in compassion, care, justice, creativity, compassion, collaboration, community. And that is not limited to people of any gender. It just so happens that we see women bringing that kind of leadership to the climate movement in droves. And this book aims to support and celebrate and accelerate that upwelling of what we've come to call the feminist climate renaissance. Not because we need only women, but because we need a full spectrum of climate leadership and all of our diverse superpowers coming to this work. And I'm really excited for you all to get to know three of the amazing contributors to this book tonight. These pages contain 41 essays, 17 poems, and original art. But we're going to focus tonight on some of the Southern voices in this collection. Southern by birth, by upbringing, by choice, or some mixture of those things. And this is feels especially sort of tender for me because the person who really taught me how to write was Jane Pepperdine, who was a retired English professor from Agnes Scott, who taught one class at my high school. And I had the real privilege of learning from her every morning for 2 years. So this feels, I don't know, just like a bit of a homecoming, albeit from a plateau in Tennessee. So I'd like to start with our poet this evening, Katharine Pierce, who is a professor at Mississippi State University. She is an NAE fellow, a Pushcart Prize winner. She is eloquent and talented, and we are so grateful to have her poem Anthropocene Pastoral in this collection. And Katharine, would you kind of ground us for the evening with your poem?
I would be delighted. Thank you, Katharine. Hi, everybody. So this is Anthropocene Pastoral. In the beginning, the ending was beautiful. Early spring everywhere, the trees furred pink and white, lawns the sharp green that meant new. The sky so blue it looked manufactured. Robins. We'd heard the cherry blossoms wouldn't blossom this year, but what was one epic blooming when even the desert was an explosion of verbena? When bobcats slinked through primroses, when coyotes slept deep in orange poppies. One New Year's Day, we woke to daffodils, wisteria, onion grass wafting through the open windows. Near the end, we were eyeletted, we were cottoned, we were sundressed and barefoot. At least it's starting gentle, we said. An absurd comfort, we knew, a placebo. But we were built like that, built to say, at least. Built to reach for the heat of skin on skin, even when we were already hot. Built to love the purpling desert in the twilight. Built to marvel over the pink bursting dogwoods, to hold tight to every pleasure, even as we rocked together toward the graying, even as we held each other, warmth to warmth, and said, sorry, I'm so sorry, while petals sifted softly to the ground all around us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mary Anne. Mary Anne is joining us from West Virginia. She is originally from Tennessee, calls West Virginia home. She is the national director of campaigns at the Sierra Club, where she also, until just recently, was leading the Beyond Coal campaign for the last decade. And she's going to read an excerpt from her essay, which is called Beyond Coal.
Good evening, everyone. It is such a treat to see all of you and be part of this. So I'll begin here in this beautiful book that I'm so excited to talk about with you all. My daughter is an 11th generation West Virginian through my husband's side of the family. And I want her to be able to raise a 12th generation here if she chooses to do so. The climate crisis is real and it's scary. And my desire to protect her from it is why I'm working to end our reliance on fossil fuels. But I also don't want her home state to become a ghost town filled with the tattered remains of faded glory. When you're hiking a tall mountain, there's something known as a false summit, a place that looks like the top from below, but once you get there, you see that you still have much farther to climb. That's how this moment feels to me, like both a summit and an overlook to the next massive climb ahead. All the progress we're making is not nearly enough. We need many more successes at an even faster pace. You have to accelerate and replicate this success economy-wide this decade. And we need to do it in a way that doesn't throw people overboard and addresses the long legacy of environmental injustice. So it's worth pausing, taking a moment to consider the hard-learned lessons of the work to rid our grid of coal power. lessons that might help guide us as we continue the ascent. Here are 10 of the lessons that I've learned.
Thanks, Mary Anne. And those 10 lessons are an exquisite gift, in my opinion, in this collection. From one MAH to another MAH, Mary Annaïse Heglar is joining us from New York City. We will come back to her Southern roots in a minute. And among other things, Mary is an incredible essayist who explores intersections of the climate crisis, emotionality, justice. Her most recent piece just came out in Rolling Stone, and she's going to read an excerpt from her essay in the collection, Home is Always Worth It.
Yeah, thank you for that, Katharine. So this section I'm going to read, I've titled very southernly, The Chickens Have Roosted. I joined the climate justice movement in earnest in 2014. Since then, I've come across a good many doomer dudes. They have books, they host panels, they are prolific tweeters, they are legion, and they're almost always white men, because only white men can afford to be lazy enough to quit on themselves. I've given them a new name, denialists. They've absorbed the disaster porn and memorized all the worst case scenarios, and they rattle them off with rapturous pleasure. They've not only accepted that our fate is sealed, they found comfort in it. So certain are they that they know how this unwritten story ends. I can only assume they're very obnoxious in movie theaters with their constant attempts to spoil the ending. To an extent, I get it. There's no denying the severity of our crisis, at least not anymore. There's no more putting it off on future generations. No more stopping global warming. It is here. The chickens have roosted. Perhaps the most terrifying part of all this is the uncertainty, the not knowing. It's unmooring, unnerving. I can understand reaching for something, anything to be sure about. And if you've nursed all that at the teat of toxic masculinity, I can understand why you might think you need to know, you might need to be the one in the room with the clear-eyed vision, the one who knows what's coming next. But no one does. Because the thing about warming, whether it happens on the globe, whether we're talking about the globe or a fever, is that it happens in degrees. That means that every slice of a degree matters. And right now, that means everything we do matters. We quite literally have no time for nihilism.
Mary, so good at taking down the doomer dudes on the regular on Twitter in this essay. And I should say before I forget, because you all may now be extremely excited about this book from those sort of 3 samplings. Charis Books and More has a bunch of copies of All We Can Save. But because this book is sold out in bookstores all over the place, it's not going to show up on their website. So if you want to get a copy through them, and please do, because they are such an incredible independent bookstore and feminist bookstore that has anchored the Atlanta community for so long, give them a ring, and they will get a copy in your hands. So team, we have not been able to celebrate in person the publication of this book. So I think we should just raise a little glass and have a cheers before we get into a bit more of a conversation. So on the note of, bourbon, it seems appropriate to ask the question, what is your connection to the South, and how does that connection impact or inform your relationship with climate work? And Mary Anne, given that you're kind of the double dipper at the moment in your southernness, could we start with you?
My pleasure. So I grew up in the Smoky Mountains in East Tennessee. where our claim to fame was, or my claim to fame was Dolly Parton went to my high school. So if you need more Southern credentials than that, I don't know what I can do for you.
Mary Anne, how do we get Dolly in the movement? Let's come back to that question.
Believe in us. We can do it. We can do it. And we were right outside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My dad was the chief scientist there. And so I just grew up in this, one of the most magical places on the planet. And it's a very beloved jewel of the South. And then fell in love with a 10th generation West Virginian and ended up here in West Virginia, where I'm now the mom of an 11th generation West Virginian, as I read. And I think there are a couple of things that I take from, I don't know, people in West Virginia. I don't know that they all know that they're in the South, but it feels pretty Southern to me. So one is a deep sense of place. And I'm sure people all across the country have a strong sense of place, but when I step out of the car and breathe the air and I feel the air on my skin in the South, I just feel like something clicks into place and I'm home and I feel like myself. And this is the place that nurtured my love for the earth. And it's also the place that taught me that the earth needs defenders. When I was growing up, there was acid rain killing the trees in the Smoky Mountains. And my dad was the chief scientist and he was trying to stop these coal plants from polluting and killing the trees and killing the fish in the Smoky Mountains. So I think it's both knowing that it's this place that nurtured my love of the earth, but also knowing that the earth needs defenders. And that also sometimes history, I think growing up in the South, you realize that history is messy and complicated and people screw up and you have to be on the side of justice and you have to be on the side of what's right. And sometimes that means being a little uncomfortable and maybe not agreeing with your neighbor or not agreeing with the people that you go to church with, but you have to find that center in yourself to stand up for what's right.
I did not know about your dad and his work. So I like that this is now a multi-generational family legacy of fighting coal plants. That is the kind of multi-generational legacy that I would like to be a part of. Katharine, I'm curious for you, from the perspective of your writing, your teaching, how do you see this intersection coming to life of climate crisis, climate solutions in this region of the country?
Yeah, well, so I'm from Delaware originally. I grew up in Delaware, and then I spent the first 30 years of my life in the Northeast and the Midwest. And so I moved to Mississippi in 2007 to teach at Mississippi State, which is what I'm still doing. And when I moved there, I had this completely new understanding of and relationship with the natural world. In the South, as you all know, it feels like nature has been handed a megaphone. Everything is just amplified, right? Like the insects are bigger and they're louder, and the humidity is like heavier. It's more humid if that's possible, and the storms are wilder, and the kudzu is just taking over on the side of the road. And so I became sort of increasingly tuned in, not only to the physical world, but also to the ways that it's changing, the ways that I'm seeing that in my day-to-day life, especially now that I'm raising kids in Mississippi also. So it seemed impossible. It's impossible for me to imagine my writing not having turned toward climate justice in some way, given the intensity of the natural world in my daily life right now. And so, yeah, like Mary Anne, that is something that I'm seeing more and more, the need for defenders of the earth, particularly in the South, and the ways that I like what Mary Anne said about speaking up and being uncomfortable at times. And I think, yes, I think that's a very important thing that I'm practicing every day. So yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Katharine. Mary, was it Alabama first and then Mississippi? Is that your sequence? Okay, talk to us about, your upbringing and how that's shaped your writing and thinking on this.
Yeah, so I was born in Talladega, Alabama. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama until I was 9. It's where most of my extended family still lives, and extended doesn't mean anything in that sentence. Like, I'm very close to like my third cousins. We moved to Mississippi when I was 9, but we always went back to Birmingham. My family, my mother's family is all from Tennessee. So my mother will swear that Tennessee is the most beautiful place in the world. And me and my brother will just be like, yeah, but Mississippi though. So it's kind of like we have that little competition. And I don't know how anyone can look at the South and not fall in love. I don't know how anyone could look at the Mississippi River and not just like have their heart sing. And how to grow up there and not want to protect it for the rest of your life is it is incredibly, incredibly beautiful in a way that just like sings to you. And also there's the thing about the culture, especially as a Black Southerner, of wanting to be on the right side of history and having that just like really implanted in you, and like understanding that things are worth fighting for, things are worth dying for, and having this like profound sense of justice rooted in you as a very young child, and wanting to, especially for my generation, I think, because I was raised by Black baby boomers, and these are the ones who like really put their lives on the line as children, and kind of wanting to pay that back. And so what can I do to try to pay that back? And that, what is existential in that way? And that kind of led me to climate. It very easily could have led me to many, many things, just because there's so many things that threaten the lives of Black people. And for me, it led me to climate.
Yeah, I think I feel some of that kind of ancestral motivation from the other side of wanting to do better than maybe generations before me did. Mary Anne, I want to turn to the topic of centralizing this conversation about climate justice and welcoming people in, something that I think the climate movement has not always been very good at, but maybe Southerners have some instinct for, kind of that sort of hospitable vibe. What do you think that veterans of climate work, whether that's a 3-year veteran or a 30-year veteran, what can we be doing to more deliberately and warmly welcome people in?
I think one of the most important things is that wherever you are, whatever you bring to this, it's enough. We need storytellers, we need artists, we need chefs, we need doctors, we need teachers, we need kids. I mean, if you just look at the youth climate movement, and you realize how much they've shifted the political conversation in the last year. You know, they don't have PhDs. They're not lawyers. They're not scientists. They're not economists. You know, they are kids who just stood up and stood together and said, we're afraid for our lives. We're not just afraid for our grandchildren, and we're going to stand up. And so I think one of the things I so wish that we could do, and I try to do, is just sort of demystify that climate change is it's just the realm of experts, and it's just the realm of scientists, and you can only participate once you know all the science, or you can only participate once you have read all of the policies, or you understand the Clean Air Act, or whatever it might be, whatever people perceive as this barrier. And I think we perhaps unintentionally have created those, whether that's through the sort of talking heads that the environmental movement for a long time has put up in front of the world, or those that the culture has pulled out, often white men, scientists who are the explainers of climate change to everyone else. But whether it was intentional or unintentional, I think that if the bar or the barrier to entry feels very high and intimidating to most people, when in reality, in my work in the Beyond Coal campaign, over the past 10 years, We have secured the retirement of 60% of the coal plants in the United States. We've gone from getting half of our electricity from coal, which was our single biggest contributor to climate change, to less than a quarter of our electricity from coal in less than a decade. And that was just led by regular people in their communities, by and large. Yes, we had lawyers and experts, and we had lots of help and support, but fundamentally that was just led by people who had a polluting coal plant in their backyard. Their kid had asthma. There was a coal ash spill in the river, and they just stood up and they said, I'm going to figure out who's making this decision, and I'm going to get involved. And it turned out oftentimes the person making that decision was not in Washington, D.C. It was in their state, or it was in their city. And so I really think that that's, we can do so much, whether it's, not using acronyms, putting different spokespeople forward, lifting up the kind of leaders that you're lifting up in this book, really honoring and celebrating the contributions of all kind of people, because we need everybody, and everybody has something to contribute. It's starting right where they are. They don't have to go get another degree or get someone else's permission to be part of this.
Yeah, totally. I think the whole topic sort of was ceded to experts for way too long, and experts being a very narrowly defined set of qualifications. And I found this, I'm teaching undergrads this semester, and they wrote op-eds for their midterm assignment. And they were really grappling with the question of credibility, right? Like, who am I to write this? And having that conversation of like, the only credential that you need to be part of this conversation is to be alive on this planet in this moment. And that's you, you're asking really big questions. You've got, profound thoughts about what we need to be doing and what's at stake. Jump in.
Yeah. Can I add something to that, Katharine?
Yeah, because we don't write about this a lot, Mary.
It drives me crazy because we don't do this with any other movement. Right? Like a lot of the time I see like, well, what's your affiliation when you step into climate spaces or environmental spaces? But nobody says that if you're like at a reproductive rights march, like what's your affiliation? But like, you care about this because you're a human being on this earth, right? Yeah. So like, why do you need credibility to want to live? It's like, why do you have a survival instinct?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's that thing of like, we end up, you engage in this so much, this question of like, what are the stories that we're telling? What are the narratives? And like, we end up with really not compelling stories when all we allow are scientists and like wonks to try to tell the story. That just does not, doesn't get us anywhere good. As one of the, I forget which youth activist this was at Climate Week last year, but Al Gore was moderating a panel, and she said, "I'm very sorry to tell you, Vice President, but your charts were extremely boring." And it also, Mary Anne, what you were saying about, the opening and the welcoming that that youth leaders are creating. The first essay in the collection is by Shea Bastida, who is a youth leader, and the closing of her essay says that a vibrant, fair, and regenerative future is possible, not when thousands of people do climate justice activism perfectly, but when millions of people do the best they can. And she writes elsewhere that, if we wait till we know it all, it'll be too late to do anything. I think part of it is just kind of challenging these myths, that you need 3 PhDs and a speechwriter to get going.
Thank you for the experts and the lawyers, and we need the wonks, but
totally
one piece of a puzzle. They're like one little part of one niche in our ecosystem. Yeah.
And like, I think actually a lot of them are very relieved not to also have to try to be the storytellers, that's a good thing. Mary, in your piece, you really, I think, walk the line that we, in some ways, tried to capture in the subtitle of the book, Truth, Courage, and Solutions. Like, not going into Pollyanna, like, gee whiz optimism land, not going into, nihilist, de-nihilist land, but like holding the problem and holding some attention to solutions, and to, the possibilities of a 2-degree world as opposed to a 3-degree world or a 4-degree world. How, like, that gloom and doom snarls people. Like, it'll grab you by the ankles and take you down. Would you just talk a little bit about kind of what you do when that happens to you, or what you've seen kind of help people stay in that space between what's really hard, and the vision that we're still working towards?
Yeah, I mean, I would be completely lying if I said that I don't, sometimes feel despondent about this. It's heavy, and it will weigh you down. And that is okay, right? Like, I take comfort in the fact that sometimes this makes me sad and, depresses me, because that means that I am human and I can feel things. You should never be able to look at the potential destruction of the whole entire world and the already destruction of so many things and feel okay. That means something's wrong. So it's good that you can feel bad about this. So 1, remembering that. 2, remembering that I don't know how this is going to turn out. And even with my most educated guesses, I have been wrong before in my life. So it's not really useful for me to figure out, are we going to win or not? Because that's one of the biggest climate questions I get. And my response is always, that's not useful. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But what you can determine is, who do you want to be? And get real clear about who you want to be, how you want to show up for yourself, for others, for the entire planet. Like, that shouldn't change no matter what happens outside of you. So whether we win or not, how do I want to go down, right? Like, if we lose tomorrow, who do I want to be that day? If no matter what happens in November, no matter what happens in December, the person I want to be shouldn't change, and get really committed to that. And just being kind to yourself, when you feel despondent. It's all right. Give yourself a break, give yourself a pass, watch some Netflix, eat something that makes you feel good, if you can, and like, pick yourself back up when you're able.
Yeah, totally. And for me, one of the biggest things has been feeling connected to other people who, are also on this like roller coaster ride of, like the grief, the fear, the anger, right? And then, and then committing to like also rise back up into that capacity for courage and determination, and as you write about so beautifully, love. I mean, I think the sense of ferocious love is really the cross-cutting thread in this book.
Yeah. I will say that the thing about climate grief that makes it so different is that it never ends. Because like, you can't get to that last stage, which is acceptance, where you just basically give up and let go of the world. I can't do that. So you're going to cycle through depression. You're going to cycle through anger. You're going to cycle. Anger is the sweet spot, really is. Use that one.
There's some good electric fuel in that.
Very useful. But you're going to go into bargaining. You're going to keep going through the cycles, and just know that that is part of the process, and you are not alone at all.
Yeah. And one thing that I've been thinking about is people sense those feelings coming, and they're like, no, I don't want to feel those. Those are too many feelings. So I'm just gonna compartmentalize that off and move on and think about something else. And when you actually go through them, it is fuel for some really powerful action that you can take in life. And I think one of the things that keeps people from getting involved is like, it's too scary to look over that cliff, so I'm just not going to look over it. Or they think, well, we're just screwed. Like, what does it even matter? What does it even matter?
Yeah.
Either I don't want to stare at how bad it could get because I can't face it, which I actually feel like we need to stare at how bad it can get so we understand the stakes, especially in the next decade.
Yeah.
But then when you do that, to not become so paralyzed, you're like, forget it. This is too much. So I think those are the two things to overcome.
Yeah. Well, shameless plug. If you are going through some of that and want to not feel alone, listen to Mary Anne's podcast, No Place Like Home with Anna Jane Joyner.
Yeah,
Yes.
and then listen to Mary Annaïse's podcast, The Real Hot Take with Amy Westervelt, which will get you fired up.
Yeah. Once you get into anger, come over to us.
I heartily agree with both of these recommendations. These are two of my favorite audio outlets. And to your point, Mary, about like, know that you're not alone. That was part of why Ayana and I really wanted to have poetry in the collection. Not only that, but this stuff is hard. So to give people a space to breathe, to feel their feelings, to know that they aren't alone, to sharpen our attention to what matters in this moment. And Katharine, I'm curious from your perspective as a poet, and kind of thinking about the role of poetry and storytelling broadly, kind of what do you think is important about bringing those ways of thinking and communicating to the topic of climate justice, and kind of where do you see your own work in that area going? You talked a little bit about where it came from, but I'm curious where you think it may be headed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think I just want to thank the other panelists, because I mean, it's so great to be hearing all of this. And I think that so much of what both Mary Anne and Mary Annaïse, or Mary, is it both names or one name? Either way. I want to get names right. So, but I think that what both of them are saying has been so helpful. And I'm thinking that, like, for me, since the 2016 election, my whole sort of activist ethos has been like, just do something. It's this idea of imperfect action, right? Because I've gone down the rabbit hole so many times of trying to make my action the best action and the perfect action and the right action. And when I do that, I lose so much time because, like so many of us, I'm incredibly busy. I have a lot of other stuff going on. And so when I can just do something, it helps me feel so much better. And it kind of pulls me out of that hole that I think it's so easy to fall down when we are looking carefully at what this actually is and what this can mean and does mean already. And so that, I think, is where poetry comes in for me. It's a way, for one thing, it's a way for me to kind of process and try to make something from the destruction, right? So if I'm able to read a news story that really kind of sends me into despair and sends me spiraling, but if I can sit down and try to build something from it that I can then put out into the world in some way, that's helpful for me, just from the perspective of not, slipping too far down the path of despair. It's a way for me to try to make something from the destruction. But I think too, right, it's this idea that you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be, an expert in the field, you have to be a person in the world, right? Somebody who is experiencing these things and has a stake in these things, as we all do. And so I'm writing from the perspective of a mother, right? That's something that really informs a lot of my work. I have 2 young boys. I'm writing from the perspective of, a woman, a Southerner, I mean, all these things, a daughter, a sister. And I'm not writing from the perspective of being a scientist, because I'm not, as any of my professors from college would tell you, I'm not writing from that perspective, but I'm writing from the perspective of being a person, right? And being a poet and being someone who feels these things and engages with all these things on a daily basis. And I think that the reality of that is something that I think poetry and fiction and any kind of art is kind of uniquely suited to put in front of people and to make it feel like, oh, these are topics that I have access to, right? Like, I'm allowed to have access to this. I mean, poetry is its own thing. I think there's also kind of that barrier that gets thrown up in front of poems sometimes, where people think, oh, well, I don't get poetry, which is a whole other thing to deal with. But the bottom line is all these outlets and these conversations should be accessible to everybody who is currently living on the planet. And so I think that any kind of art is uniquely suited to make it more available for public discussion.
The last question that I want to ask to all three of you, and then we're going to jump into some Q&A from the audience. Hi, audience. We can't see you, but we're very delighted to know that you're there and to be in conversation with you. So All We Can Save opens with the person who discovered that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would lead to planetary warming. And her name was Eunice Newton Foote, and she connected these dots in 1856. 1856. You cannot say that we have not known. She published a paper, and then she was basically forgotten / dismissed until about a decade ago. And the Irish physicist John Tyndall, who published kind of similar and more detailed work on the subject 3 years later, is considered the grandfather of climate science. Interestingly enough, he opposed women's suffrage, and Eunice Newton Foote was a signatory to the Seneca Falls Declaration, so the manifesto created at the first women's rights convention in the U.S. And her husband also signed, along with Frederick Douglass and some other extremely cool gentlemen of the day. I sort of like to think of Eunice as the first climate feminist. And I'm curious kind of if that is a term that means something to you, if it's something you identify with, if it is kind of what it means, and if you think it is kind of a useful way to articulate this nexus of gender justice and climate justice. Whoever's feeling moved.
Kick it off. When you share that, the first person that comes to my mind is my mom. And my mom grew up in Southeast Ohio on the Appalachian part of Ohio without a lot of money. And she wanted to be a park ranger. And her family told her that that was not an appropriate job for a girl. And her options were to be a nurse, a teacher, or a secretary. So she chose teacher, and she was an amazing teacher and an amazing principal later of a whole school. And anybody who has a principal in your family knows what a hard job that is. And she was great at it. And I wonder what kind of park ranger she would have been, and I wonder what she would have done if she would have been able to follow her true calling. And that's just one generation away from me. And when I was coming up in the environmental movement, it was very macho. It was like the 90s, very macho, very like sort of a lot of swaggering and whatnot. And so I just sort of absorbed that was the culture you had to fit yourself into. But I wrote my master's thesis about 3 women who played a big role in environmental history that I felt like had been overlooked because I learned environmental history and there were no women in the books. And I was like, come on, there were women doing things like in the 60s and the 50s and the whatever. There's not just Rachel Carson. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was one of them. She was in Florida, a Southerner, and the school in Parkland where that horrible shooting took place was named for her. And she was an incredible activist and an incredible champion for the Everglades. And so to me, a climate feminist is creating this work that we're doing to heal the world that allows everybody to bring their best gifts to this, including my mom, including all of those women that were overlooked in our environmental history, and my daughter, just creating a movement and creating a world where they can bring their full potential. And through that experience, you know, where it's more collaborative, more mutually supportive. It's like a web. It's like a web of relationships where we're all together trying to figure this out, as opposed to like competitive and turfy and super, super macho. And so, yes, is the answer.
Guess what? When you're trying to solve just the biggest problem on the planet, there is room for everyone.
Let's not have half of the population be in some sort of secondary role. Let's take it seriously. That's not going to get us.
Totally.
I'll just kind of piggyback off of what Mary Anne was saying, talking about a collaborative approach. I really like that phrasing. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, that phrase absolutely, you know, is something that I identify with, because I was thinking about intersectionality, right, as a way to approach this. There needs to be an intersectional approach that views climate not as some sort of abstract or standalone crisis, but as something that's just impacting human rights across the board, freedoms in very real and immediate ways across the board. And I think it also means amplifying and pushing for the amplification of the voices of women doing the climate work, and sort of, you know, raising those voices up and kind of providing other women climate leaders with a megaphone to do that work and let them be heard.
Yeah.
So I guess I still don't have a firm answer, because I struggled for a long time with the word feminist, because it just felt like I didn't want another label as a Black woman. I just sort of felt like I've got a million labels to juggle now. I got to keep up with another one. And
where do I even put this one?
Right, exactly. Like I'm out of pockets. And then I also kind of struggle with it because feminism doesn't have the most inclusive history. Yeah. But then when my friends, you know, sort of explained it, it was, you believe women deserve equal rights. And I was like, you got to name that? You know, like that needs a name. So I still kind of struggle for it, because it was kind of like, that feels redundant. And so climate feminists, I guess I'm still having kind of the same reaction, like we got to name this. But then on the other hand, you know, I've heard about a great many environmental activists in history, largely women who launch, who come into it from the conservation angle of wanting to protect wild spaces because they're beautiful, and then wanting to extend women's rights in terms of reproduction that quickly turns into population control. And then the conservation quickly turns into protecting wild places and like from people of color, and like turns into anti-immigration. So then on one hand, I feel like climate feminists is like, really, we got to name this. And then on the other hand, I feel like there's a word missing, because there's still room for racism in that term.
Yeah.
So I don't have a firm answer. I'm not against it, but I'm still thinking.
Yeah. Well, I'm always excited about anything that your wheels are still turning on. So I want to come back. Yeah. For sure. Well, let's see what has been coming up into our, let me just juggle a few windows here on the computer. All right, we've got one question. What are some ways we can create opportunities through climate justice oriented policy for communities that are currently facing disproportionate harm and climate injustice? So how can we use this moment to make society better or less worse for marginalized communities? So maybe this is kind of well summarized as the, you know, we're either multi-solving or we're not solving at all. How do we address sort of near-term needs and injustices while we're trying to work towards this longer-term kind of global challenge? Mary Anne, I'm curious if you'd be game to talk about that from the perspective of Beyond Coal especially, and just transition.
Yes, absolutely. A couple of pieces of that. One, I think is regulation. Frankly, just putting some rules of the road in place that are going to address the pollution hotspots in communities of color that are think, a shameful legacy in this nation of our failures of our environmental policy to date. So you just regulations, rules of the road, they can clean up that pollution. They can require that these communities of color that have been disproportionately polluted for so long, that those polluters have to clean up their act. And that's within the power of the EPA, that's within the power of our the executive branch of the government, but it's also within the power of a lot of state agencies in terms of whether or not they have strong rules and whether they enforce them. Another is investment. And, you know, when there's a new round of whatever it might be, whether it's COVID recovery or stimulus or infrastructure spending, to focus those investments in communities that have been left behind in those investments in the past, communities of color, very intentionally, and then have also the process of how those investments are spent be led by folks in those communities. That's another thing that, again, can happen at the federal or the state level. So we have a lot of tools in our toolbox, and there are things that we could do. You know, in a new presidential administration, we could do in a lot of our states right now. And you do have a lot of great policy leaders in the book, like Rihanna Gunn-Wright and others who have been laying the policy groundwork for some of those really good ideas those folks are in All We Can Save. Yeah,
there's a great piece by Rihanna, a great piece by Maggie Thomas, who was Jay Inslee's climate policy team, and then Elizabeth Warren's. Some really exciting thinking about what the future of climate policy can look like, and the process by which we arrive at climate policy that is more just, more multi-solving, more attentive to those questions, as you were saying, Mary Anne, of not just what we do, but how it gets done, who benefits, all of those critical questions.
I think at least the Sierra Club, and I think other long-standing white-led environmental organizations are, at least I was speaking for the Sierra Club, are taking a step back and looking at how we've come up with those policies in the past, and who was at the table and who wasn't in the room, and realizing we need to make some shifts there. And I think the process and who's in the room is just as important as the policy.
Yeah. There's a question about how you each found your places in this movement, how you were able to figure out what role was best for you, or maybe a way that you found a role was definitely not the role for you. I think sometimes the dead ends are the most helpful teachers. Would anyone be willing to share a story of kind of where you came to an aha, or a like, stop going this way, turn around?
I mean, I can do it. So I guess before I go on a tangent, the thing is to do what you're good at, because everything is climate, right? So you might feel like, I'm an athlete. What do? You can bring activism into your athleticism. You absolutely can. There's many ways. Everything that you touch, everything that you do can be made climate. It's the whole world. For me, I got into it because I've always been a communications person. I've always worked in nonprofits. I've always wanted to be part of telling a really important story. And I very much made myself into an editor. And in 2014, I knew that I was leaving my job, and I was like, I want to work on the most important story. And I decided that was climate. And so I started looking for environmental organizations to work at. And I joined one as the editor of these policy publications, which are these really dense, really wonky reports. And if you're an editor, that means that you're going to dig in and you're going to interrogate it and you're going to really understand it. And so my first couple of years, there were so many times where I called the writer and was like, am I reading this right? Because if so, there's a lot of bodies in between these lines. And you start looking even closer and you start to see how serious it is. And that's terrifying. And what I needed some way to process that. And the way that I knew to process things from the time I was a really little kid was through writing. And so I started writing and I started putting it out into the world because I felt like no one's talking about the human toll of this. No one's talking about what it feels like to deal with this. And if I can help just one person feel less alone because they happen to stumble upon my little Medium blog, then that's worth it. And so I started doing that, and I kept going because ultimately I was writing for myself. I was writing to process something and to, you know, get a catharsis. And if it helps someone else, then it helps someone else. And, you know, now we're here.
I love that guidance of do what you're good at. Bring your superpowers. Like, no, you know, tick the box 5 things you can do to save the planet. That is going to undersell what you can bring to this movement every damn time.
And I can just give a quick example of when I was like, oh, I should not do this. You know, like a lot of people, you finish college and you're like, I want to make the world better. Maybe I should go to law school. And I took a class as an undergrad, and I realized, like, oh my gosh, if I go to law school, I'm going to have to read and write extremely dry, technical, sort of impenetrable things and pick them apart. And that's like, it brings me no joy whatsoever. And turns out that's not what I want to do. And so I have happily embraced my inclination, which is to be more of a generalist and to, you know enough about how we make electricity in this country, or how we make laws, or what motivates people to get involved, or what have you, that I can hopefully put those pieces together and be of service. But I'm the sort of living embodiment. You don't have to be like an issue expert or a technical person to be able to make a contribution.
Contribute. Yeah. One of these questions is so great, and I'm going to give kind of a Cliff Notes answer. It is, someone heard Katharine Hayhoe say that the most important thing we can do as individuals is not to act as individuals, but to join a group and work with others. Or, you know, in the words of Bill McKibben, it is number 1, organize, number 2, organize, number 3, organize. And if you've still got some energy left, work on changing your light bulbs. The question is about kind of favorite groups. And the thing that's wonderful is that almost, I won't say every essay, many of the essays in this collection lift up one group or another doing different kinds of work. And we created a handy appendix of referenced organizations. So if you are looking for an organization to learn from, volunteer with, try to get a job with, etc., give money, all those things, that list could be a good place to start. Unless, does anyone have one they like really want to shout out? Obviously, Sierra Club is an amazing membership organization that is active all over the country.
I think the main thing is there's a spectrum of, you know, every like youth climate activist, or the Sierra Club as a chapter in every state. You know, there's some groups that are really heavy on law and policy, some groups that are faith, some groups that are really environmental justice, community. So there's a whole spectrum, and I think it's find the place where it matches most with what you are most. There's a great one of the climate marches, someone was holding a sign, and it said, my favorite sign, it said, I kept saying somebody should do something about this. And then I realized maybe that somebody is me. So listening to that voice inside of yourself of which piece of this draws you the most, there's an organization out there to match you.
Totally. And if you show up to one meeting or a training or something and it doesn't feel like your jam, like it doesn't feel like the right fit, that's okay. You know, a little speed dating never hurt anyone. Or maybe it does. You know, you may not come out unscathed, but you may find your soulmate in the process. Let's see. Thoughts on addressing climate justice globally. Our country, as a privileged nation, will be better off than most if nothing is done. How do we deal with this beyond our own borders, especially given the othering that has been happening blatantly through the government the past 4 years? Anybody want to talk about that?
Well, I think that there's nothing you can do about climate change that stays local. So like if you reduce emissions in the United States, you are addressing it globally. So the mitigation is always global. Any reduction is a reduction anywhere. But it's the adaptation where we really need to start thinking globally. And I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is immigration. We have turned a refugee crisis into an immigration crisis, as though the people trying to get from the global south to the global north are doing so by choice. It's no longer people immigrating because of aspirations. They're immigrating because of desperation. And we need, more than anything, a compassionate response to that. We need to, as a country, start looking at those faces and seeing ourselves, because it's happening within our borders too. We will not get out of this unscathed. We are not unscathed. California is on fire. Louisiana is sinking, and New York will too. So I think we actually have to get out of the idea that we'll get out of it unscathed. Maybe Sweden will. I actually don't think that they will. I don't think New Zealand will. I think that some people just have a delay, but it's not going to stop at their borders. Climate change doesn't respect borders because borders aren't real. And so we've got to start thinking that way.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people point who wanted us to not act on climate, and they point at China or they point at India and they say, oh, well, why should we do our part because those other countries are polluting a lot? And just imagine if we figure this out, if we get a power grid with 100% clean energy, if we electrify our buildings and our transportation, if we innovate policies that center racial justice in climate solutions, if we do this right here and create all the economic opportunity and all of the great benefits that would flow from that, then that, I think, is one of the single most important things we can do to send a signal to all of the other parts of the world that may be dragging their feet on doing their part on climate change. So we can't point at other countries and then use that as an excuse not to act for ourselves. That's not leadership. And this is a time for leadership.
And just to kind of jump in also as a poet and as a writer, I think another thing that's really useful is to think about the idea of those false borders and reading literature from other cultures, other countries around, global literature. Reading this is a way to expand empathy. I mean, it's impossible to imagine those borders as actual things when you're reading about the lived experiences of people who live in places where you don't live. And so I think that's such an essential part of this, and gets back to that idea of the kind of just like the human-based side of it, and just being a person on the earth and just engaging with the world in a way makes it impossible not to act in some way, which is also like a really simplistic way to approach it, but I think that ingredient is in there. I think it needs to be in there also.
Yeah. I wish we could just keep going and going, because I'm just like delighted to sit here and listen to you all. But I think we should, respect roughly our time boundaries. And we are extremely excited that Mary has agreed to close us out with I think it's actually the closing poem of the collection also, by Alice Walker. Would you do us the honor, Mary? And I know.
The honor is all mine. I adore Alice Walker. Yeah, I'd be thrilled. I will just tell you a quick story of when I met another very famous Black poet from the South, Nikki Giovanni. I met her once in college at some conference or something, and I fangirled out so hard that she was slowly backing away from me. So yeah, this will be I'm gonna pretend I'm doing this in front of Alice Walker, and I'm being cool.
Okay.
It's called Calling All Grandmothers by Alice Walker. We have to live differently, or we will die in the same old ways. Therefore, I call on all grandmothers everywhere on the planet to rise and take your place in the leadership of the world. Come out of the kitchen, out of the fields, out of the beauty parlors, out of the television. Step forward and assume the role for which you were created, to lead humanity to health, happiness, and sanity. I call on all the grandmothers of the earth in every person who possesses the grandmother spirit of respect for life and protection of the young to rise and lead. The life of species depends on it. And I call on all men of earth to gracefully and gratefully stand aside and let us do so.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Katharine. Thank you, Mary Anne. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Agnes Scott. Thank you, Charis Books. What a wonderful way to spend a Monday evening. I feel revved up.
Thank you, Katharine. Cheers to you.
Cheers, my friends. Yeah, and may we all be, as Mary Robinson says, angry grannies for climate justice. Like, that is how I feel on the interior. I can't wait till I can plausibly carry a cane. And
yeah, I call myself an angry auntie.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Susan, we'll hand it over to you.
Right. So I'm so glad the word gratitude or gratefully was in Alice Walker's poem, because this has been, I would say, a season of gratitude, but really a year of gratitude in juxtaposition to the things that we're not always grateful for that are happening. And so it's become a word I've used much more this year, and I want to use it now for all of you to say we're so grateful to you for your time and for your energy to produce the book and to produce your work. I expected to be inspired, but I feel like I'm more inspired than I could have imagined I would have been. And I think it's the whole context within that your work is within this work. And Katharine mentioned at the beginning that the climate crisis is a crisis of leadership. And, you are our word leaders. I jotted down so many wonderful phrases from the Fall Summit to nature has been handed a microphone in the South to climate grief. Just these are the things that we can broaden audiences with, having your stories and your words in front of us. So very grateful for your word, instead of thought leaders, although you're that too, we'll call you word leaders. I want to say that so are our students at Agnes Scott College. I think we do have, I know we have several classes on this call. A creative writing class for sure is with us that works on positive journalism. So they've been asking questions and taking notes. And I've really found the not just leadership comes to the Center for Sustainability from our students, but they really reverse the table, and they're our teachers. And several of you referred to the youth climate movement, and that's so important to us here at Agnes Scott. So thank you for giving us more and new words. Two last things. One is that I want to underscore what Katharine said, that Charis Books and More, our sponsor, is you need to phone in your order, and when we send an email out immediately after this event, you'll get that phone number in that email, so you don't even have to look it up. Actually, three more things. Then I want to thank, speaking of our student leaders, young alums, there have been two people behind the scenes, which is very literal when you're doing Zoom. So Emma Dufresne is a recent alum in our office. Thank you, Emma, out there in Zoom land. And Laura Keel is a junior who volunteers in our office. So this goes on your resume, Laura. So my very last thing is to say we all, I think, would love for this dialogue to continue. There will be ways through Agnes Scott College for that to happen. I know there'll be ways through the All We Can Save project to do that. The big announcement is that a year from now, Agnes Scott will be doing a conference on climate justice and global women's leadership in climate. So you were really sort of our beginning of a 12-month period of planning and announcement, and what a great way to kick off that future event. So
awesome.
Thank you. And thanks to the audience, as Katharine said. It's been so great to see the numbers of people and all the questions. So we're glad you were with us tonight. Stay with us. So thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye, all.